right? Before I share a few of my own memories, I did want to thank our readers from today's church service. As you heard from Faye, where are you, Faye? Hello. Faye and Tom were Dagmar's neighbors. Together they shared many great chats and dinners, and she was always there to help my mom, including taking her to the hospital several times. Thank you. Lots of visits. Stacy Smith is my amazing wife. That was a close one in the service there. She almost went up to correct the priest, which would have been like Stacy. Anyways, she has been a huge support for me over the last month, more than she knows. My mom thought of her as her own daughter. Thank you. I needed that break. They shared a formidable female fortitude. How's that for alliteration? And finally, George, where are you? Thank you. There he is. George Hanus is my cousin through my mom's sister. He is the wise one in the family, okay? He keeps us flying straight. He made countless visits to see my mom in Bronte and Collingwood with his wife Paula over the years. Thank you to all of you. So I want to share a few memories about Dasha, but I really struggled to know where to start and finish because my mom was a memory maker, either from her life events or the inspiring actions she continued to take into her 90s. Last night, I decided to go with 5 themes inspired by her favorite pictures, and I had a lot of pictures to go through. So here we go. By the way, I hope that these memories give a bit more context for the pictures and books that are on display in the hallway and around the room. For those of you that have been in her apartment, there were photos, galleries, albums all over the place, so I tried to do the best. So let's begin to talk about resilience. While born into wealth, she was faced with the ravages of World War II. While it didn't directly affect her, what did affect her was the rise of communism in 1948 when they took over her homeland. Imagine having to transform your life's expectations literally in a day. Your father gets locked out of the factory that he had built. Your home is taken away, and you become a persona non grata. This all at the age of 16. She took nothing for granted from then on. You can imagine how tough it must have been to earn her bachelor's music degree, given most schools didn't even want to talk to her, didn't want to accept her. That was just dangerous. She lived several decades, quite happy, sort of surviving in communism, and then she met my dad. And they went on a honeymoon in 1968. As they were about to take the train back to Prague from Vienna, they woke up to see the newspaper headlines announcing Russian tanks have rolled into Prague. So she restarts her life again in Canada. My dad and my mom came to Canada literally with knapsacks on their back, and they started their life here. Now, I gotta be honest, her brother and her sister were a huge help, and many of that family are here today, which is awesome. So they did it together with them, and they became successful, and they made Canada their new home. They restarted their lives at 40, and they did a great job of it. Her life had told her to prize even the smallest things. She took nothing for granted, and that included making her own sleeping bags, paddling in homemade kayaks, to sewing curtains for the house. She learned to tackle challenges head-on, one day at a time. Oh, and then there is a story about the Canadian goose, but I will let someone else tell you about that one. Determination. Whether it was teaching students, mentoring opera singers, adjudicating music festivals, giving master classes on music, accomplishing a physical feat, or keeping her family together and happy, my mom had no lack of determination. She knew exactly how she wanted things to be, for others and for herself. And she always did it with a smile. I have this vivid memory from the cottage we had north of Ottawa for 3 decades, where she was determined to swim every day, regardless of the temperature. You guys have probably heard some of these stories, right? Who's been? There are a few of you that have been up there before. It was a pretty wild place. Anyways, she would count her strokes when she went swimming. And she would do this even when the snow was falling. She had to get in the water if she was up there. And here's a little interesting thing. A few of you experienced this. the less she wore, the more she was determined to swim longer and longer. So yeah, those are some scary skinny dips there. This determination continued literally to her very last days. She called me so excited. She's like, Martin, I got some great news for you, because she would call me every evening, or I'd call her. And she's like, Martin, I swam 20 laps again. I was like, well, that's fantastic. And she's like, yeah, I know. I've been building up every single day. I was aiming for 20. I was going to tell you when I hit 20. So she told me that. And I remember, she had had a heart attack in November. She had had 3 stents put in, a heart valve operation, a sore shoulder, and an infection in her foot in the space of about 5 months. And here she was, swimming 20 laps again, proud to share that. The trips that she organized with incredible determination for her family, with my dad during their retirement, and with me, were always filled with unique experiences she had meticulously researched. I have more than 50 trip albums that line her shelves in her library to commemorate her determined look at trips. And finally, her determination to keep the family together and happy have certainly been an inspiration for her granddaughter, Hannah. Where is she? Yeah, there she is over there. I had to call you out at some point. I know you're trying to hide. And for Stacy and I, of course. About activity. She loved music, movement, and nature, and good food. When we were in Europe last year for her 91st birthday, we visited Vienna. We went from the Vienna Opera House to the Kartnerstrasse, from the Schwarzenberg Gardens to dinner in an old square. Dasha was unstoppable. I remember texting my friends afterwards, exhausted, letting them know that my 91-year-old mum had outlasted me and outdone me. She loved being outside and moving. She was an accomplished cross-country skier and downhill skier, hiker, swimmer, paddler, and in her early years, even a dancer. Things I didn't know until I started going through pictures. I remain inspired by her daily routine of strength and stretching in the morning, even before she got out of bed, swims in the afternoon, and sunset walks afterwards. Many of you who live in Bronte have probably seen her out there with her poles striding along. Thank you to Leslie, who unfortunately can't be here today, who was a huge help to my mom, making sure she kept up her activities over the last few months. About community. She often talked about the energy she got from being around people like you. Now take that as a huge compliment. She had an uncanny sense about people who were energy takers and was careful to keep her distance from them. You're in the good books again. One of her best community quotes I found in one of her cards she loved to write is, think about others and try to help them when you can. It will make you happy. Her many communities made her happy for sure. The Czech community was a big part of her life from the day she landed here in Canada in 1968. Sokol, a gymnastics group, was also a big part of it. And I know some of you are still here, I think, that have exercised with her and traveled to Czechia and back. Interestingly enough, I'm searching, Dagmar Rydlo because I'm just trying to get a little bit more information about her career, and all of a sudden I have this thing that pops up on Google about some CBC interview. I'm like, oh, I never knew about this, so click on it. She was so involved with the Czech community, she got selected by CBC to be one of the Czech people to be interviewed when Václav Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia, passed away. And there she was, interviewed on CBC again. No idea she was a spokesperson for the Czech community. So, things you learn. Her living community, in the building she lived in here in Oakville, as well as in Canada, in Collingwood, were tremendously important to her. And a special thank you to all of you who are here from Marine Drive. And of course, her musical community. I don't know where to start. By the way, I found out that there's a huge group of her students that are here. So, thank you. In fact, one of them traveled from Wisconsin to be here, so extra round of applause. Thank you. Anyways, I was trying to figure out what do I share about music for my mom, who had so many musical interests. And I landed on the Collingwood Music Festival. It was her last passion, so to speak. Led by Daniel Vnukovsky and Elizabeth Halbertsma. Where are you, Elizabeth and Shaling? Hello, how are you? They came down from Collingwood today. The Collingwood Music Festival is something that was created by Daniel and continues to be a thriving, growing musical festival. My mom took a huge liking to it. She loved working with Daniel. She talked to Dean all the time. And you may have heard her actually calling into the new classical FM to actually make requests and comment on the music and make suggestions about what should be played. And oftentimes she would call up Daniel afterwards and go, by the way, Daniel, that wasn't pronounced correctly, and you should also play this piece. She just loved that musical community. Finally, I also want to thank several families who gave my mom an extra sense of community and belonging. Ivanka and Georgi, where are you? Thank you. Faye and Tom, the Swobodas, Zita and David, and many others who brought Dagmar into their family as a respected elder, not just as an old person. Thank you. Okay, and finally, family. This one I had like so many pictures. I was like, all right, I'm just going to cram it into one slide and we'll make the best of it. My mom always talked about her family, especially older brother and sister. And fortunately, her closest family continues to live here in Ontario. George and Paula, Mia and Len, your grandkids, your kids, it's great to have them here. Amazingly, she stayed very close with her family in Czechia. We had to have 2 birthday parties for her in Prague last year to see them all. Another quote I found in a card says it all. Family is the biggest treasure in life. Keep that warm feeling of having a home for your whole life. She had a very open definition of family. While we were living in Montreal, she was given the opportunity to adopt a 15-year-old soccer player who had defected from Czechia from a flight coming from Cuba. 15 years old, left his mom, left his family. The Russians didn't want to let the rest of the family come. Anyways, through a long, meandering story, she brought him into her house and treated him like her own son. She visited him in Europe and enjoyed having calls with him from all over the far-flung locations as he was a cruise line executive. Jan, where are you? I know you're here somewhere. There you are. Thank you for being here. She also remained incredibly committed to generational friends who she really considered family. The Pelnars have traveled here from the United States to respect this incredible friendship that goes all the way back to the grandparents in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. So the Pelnars, thank you for coming all this way. Where are you? Thank you so much. She was equally appreciative of being part of Stacy's family, the Smiths. She was welcomed with open arms to this boisterous Smith family and their reunions, and she cherished these gatherings to the very end. Many of the Smiths are here. Thank you. Awesome having you here. Finally, you're probably wondering about her secret for living into her 90s with a sound mind and an active lifestyle. Resilience, determination, activity, and family are all a big part of it. I also found the following notes beside her bed that I think provide some more clues to her health span and lifespan. It's like she read the book, but I know she didn't. Be social. Sleep 6 to 9 hours. Eat a balanced diet. And literally, she had this written down. Less fat, less sugar, more vegetables, fruits, and legumes. Be optimistic. Believe you can live longer. Mental and physical health are critical. Do strength and stretching every day. And exercising is your built-in anti-aging agent. Pretty cool, eh? So out on the memory table, you'll see a few other books and quotes that were near and dear to my mom, so please enjoy them. All right, I've gone longer than 10 minutes, so I apologize, but here we are. Let's start sharing some great moments and memories. I'd like to ask Mia, my cousin from Dagmar's brother's side, to come start things off. Mia, where are you? You're up.
That's great, Mark. Okay, I probably should have brought some tissues, but I think I'm going to be okay. So, my name is Mia, and I am Dasha's niece, and I'm really honored to have been asked to speak about my Aunt Dasha. So, Dagmar, or Dasha, as she was known in the Czech community, had many roles. Mother, grandmother, I don't know where Hannah is, mother-in-law, friend, piano teacher, mentor. But to me, she was my beloved Teta Dasha. And Teta means aunt in Czech. I have so many wonderful memories of my Teta going all the way back to my childhood. So, Martin, buckle up. So I remember a family camping trip with her and my Uncle Vladya when she was pregnant with Martin. So you would think camping would not be the most desirable activity for a woman who was pretty pregnant, at least to my 6-year-old eyes. But I can vividly picture Dasha swimming in the freezing cold lake in Maine and climbing up on a very large boulder to sun herself with her very pregnant belly. Bathing suits optional. The water was never too cold for Dasha, and her love of swimming lasted until the end of her days. Dasha would always be the first one in the water, no matter how cold or choppy or undesirable or rainy or snowy. I remember watching the moon landing with Dasha in her living room in Montreal. I think she and Vladya had just recently arrived in Montreal, and our families were very close. As refugees from the communist regime in the then Czechoslovakia, our 3 families, so my teta Maika, Uncle George, and their 2 boys, George and Otto, my father Frank, mother Etta, my brother Frank and I, and Dasha, my uncle Vladya, and soon-to-be cousin Martin, held close together in the new world. This is where I might need the tissue. I feel I must acknowledge a supreme sacrifice. Oh, thank you. Is it clean? Thank you. Okay, thanks. I feel that I must acknowledge a supreme sacrifice that Dasha made to help my family in 1966. Some of you may know our history. My parents chose to escape from the communist regime in Czechoslovakia to give my brother and I a better chance at life in a free world. My brother and father were caught crossing the border at night in Bulgaria, while my mother and I managed to escape to freedom and ultimately ended up in Canada. Not long after, Dasha received a knock on the door, and there was a man from the STB, the Czech secret police, standing there with my 3-year-old brother. The man asked her if she knew where her brother was. That would be my father, Frank. And she replied that as far as she knew, he was on vacation with his family. Well, of course she knew that our family was going to attempt an escape across the border, but knew better than to say so. Dasha was told that my father had been arrested, caught at the border, and was awaiting a prison sentence. And what should they do with the boy? Without hesitation, Dasha said she would take him. Oh my gosh. And spent the next year looking after 3-year-old little Frank. At this point, no one knew what had happened to my mother and I. But Dasha was able to determine through a relative who had consular connections that we had made it through Vienna to Canada and were with my Aunt Micah in Montreal. But that's a whole other story. My point here is that Dasha was incredibly selfless, and without any hesitation took my brother in and cared for him like his own mother until my father was released from prison. My family was eventually reunited in 1968 in Montreal, and shortly afterward, Dasha and her dear Vladya arrived in Montreal too. But I really wanted to take a moment here to acknowledge and express my thanks for what Dasha did for our family. Okay, on a lighter note. When I was in college, I spent about 2 months living with Dasha, Vladya, and Martin while I did a school placement and learned to work with people with disabilities. I was 18 years old and a little bit rebellious, but Dasha opened her home to me. It was then that I learned what a good parent she was. I saw how she supported the then 12 or 13-year-old Martin in his various pursuits, and with her very down-to-earth and common-sense approach, was raising him to be kind, determined, and an empathetic young man. But we will not talk about how annoying Martin was to my 18-year-old self. I recall moonwalking, trumpet playing, all kinds of things. Okay, when my children, Tommy and Justin, were small, we used to visit Dasha and Vladya up at their most cherished cottage on Lake Gagnon in Quebec. It was a small cottage with no electricity or running water, built up on a cliff overlooking a pristine lake. And this remote place was just wonderful. When we first started going there, it only had boat access. But eventually there was a terrible road full of ruts and boulders and potholes that led to the cottage, but it didn't matter because the place was paradise. And Dasha always made an effort to make the vacation so fun for the boys. One year we went fishing at a stocked pond where the boys got to see a beating heart placed on a counter after the trout had been killed. Yuck, they loved it. Another year we canoed along the path of the full moon at midnight, saw northern lights, and made a kayak trip through the various channels around Lake Gagnon. I would make us a cocktail every evening, a Caesar, and we would toast the sunset and talk about the adventures we had that day. So I have to tell a funny story. The first time the boys and I were at Lake Gagnon, and my poor husband, he was always at home working, right? So I would take the boys, we would go off on vacation, and Len would be at home, you know.
Some of this I'm not sad I missed it.
Okay. So the first time we were up at Lake Gagnon, the boys must have been about 5 and 7, and Dasha decided to go for her before dinner swim. She was an avid swimmer, as we all know, and would log many kilometers throughout the summer. I didn't know she counted her strokes, though, so that's something new. The boys were standing in the cottage overlooking the lake, looking out the window, and there swam Dasha in the nude, doing the backstroke right under the window, and I can still hear the boys yelling, "She's naked! She's naked!" And I was like, come away from the windows, boys, it's okay. But Dasha didn't mind, right? She had a theory of why wet a perfectly dry bathing suit, and she lived by that. And she was embracing nature and enjoying her swim and unabashedly herself. I loved her for that. Okay, so over the years, sorry, I'm almost done. Over the years, I have so many wonderful memories of Dasha, but one of the things that stands out for me was her devotion to her siblings. She was 11 years younger than her sister Micah and 10 years younger than my dad, Frank. When Micah was in her final years, Dasha would drop by her apartment just about every day. She would bring her food or just stop by for a visit, take her shopping, or go for a walk by the lake. And she was such an amazing support to Micah when she needed her most. And when my father was dying of cancer many years ago, Dasha connected him not only to a natural healer, but also a Tibetan monk. I don't know where she found that monk, but although nothing was able to save my father, the monk brought him great comfort. And the monk said to my dad, "Good life, good death." So that's what you need to strive for. You need to strive to have a good life and strive to have a good death. And that is something, it's been more than 25 years now, but it's something that has really stayed with me. And I'm so grateful that in the end, that Dasha had a good and merciful death. She had the kind of death that we all wish for, right? Yes. Peaceful and in her sleep. She went to sleep and she didn't wake up. So I think that's a blessing. Dasha will be greatly missed. I am so grateful that she had that extra time after the heart attack in November. I'm grateful that she got to meet my grandson, her great-nephew Jack, who some of you may have met today. And I'm grateful that we have a picture of 4 generations. The last year I had the opportunity to spend some time with Dasha, either at her place, either at her place in Oakville or in Collingwood. We had some delightful sleepovers with wine and lots of great stories. We had lovely walks along the lakeshore and great hikes along the many trails that Dasha loved in the Blue Mountain and Collingwood area. And we also had an opportunity to have numerous visits together in Prague. And that's where she really shone. She loved the concerts and the culture and really was just in pursuit of fun every single day. For our family, Dasha is the end of an era. She was the last of the elder generation and our last connection to the old times in Europe. She became the family historian and imparted her wisdom on my generation and my children's generation. I will miss Dasha's sense of humor, her great laugh, and her connection to our history. I will miss her most positive outlook on life. She could always find the silver lining. Didn't matter, what you were telling her, she would always find that silver lining. And I'm so grateful that I had so many years with her. And no one else will call me Miachku, which is kind of heartbreaking. I will treasure my wonderful memories of Dasha, and I will keep them close in my heart. Thank you.
So good afternoon. My name is George Hanus, in Czech, Jiří Hanus. And I am the cousin of Martin, the cousin of Mia. And I'll talk about my impressions and my memories of Dasha. There are many. They're innumerable, probably as many as the photographs that Martin had found. But I'll go back to a little bit of history about our family. My parents and I immigrated to Canada. They were from Czechoslovakia. They left in January 1948, just before the communist takeover, and we were living in Amsterdam, where I was born. And then as a young fellow, I came over to Canada, and a few years later, my brother was born. So in the 50s and up to the mid-60s, we were a family of four, and managing very well, and my dad was very successful in his business activities. And then all of a sudden, these relatives started to show up. Mia and her mother in 66, I think. And then Mia's father and her brother 2 years later. And then all of a sudden, two more relatives, Dasha and Vladia. And then, oh my goodness, in 1970, we had another cousin. So our family was overwhelmed by all of these new relatives, but it was ultimately a very, very wonderful experience. And we lived we met very, very regularly. And one of the traditions that started around that time was our annual Christmas gathering, where we would get all the members of the three families together at somebody's house. It was always either my mother's house, mother and father, or Frank and Edda, or then Vladia and Dasha. And we would just gather. That was the one time in the year when we were all very, very together. And it was just wonderful to experience each other and to share stories and to learn from each other. And that tradition has continued, and we hope that it will continue into this year and onwards, even though we have, of course, lost many family members over the years. Mia touched on the Montreal memories and the more recent ones here. I thought I would share with you a number of my more recent experiences with Dasha. As Martin mentioned, Paula and I visited her quite regularly, either here in Oakville or up in Collingwood. But I also had regular chats with her, not as many as Martin. He talked with her daily. I talked with her maybe twice or three times during a week. And for Paula, it was a very frustrating conversation because it was always in Czech. So I would be talking in Czech and then Collingwood and and Oakville and And so every so often there'd be an English word thrown in, but the bulk of the conversation was in Czech. And for me, it was wonderful because it allowed me to maintain contact with the Czech language. And I learned a lot of words from her. Good ones and bad ones, but but it was just wonderful to have a discussion with her. And as already has been touched on, you could talk to her about culture, about politics, about art, about travel, and so forth. And she was very knowledgeable on a whole slew of topics, and had her thoughts and opinions about all of these topics. My most immediate memories of her, and there are many, but two projects that I worked on when I was taking care of my mother's estate after she passed away. I discovered three diaries that my mother had written from 1937 to 1946. So from the age of 15 to the age of 24. And critical years, of course, just before the Second World War, because of the well-to-do family that she came from, she spent a year at a Swiss finishing school and decided to start writing her diaries there. And just kept on writing, 37, 38, 39, through the war years until 1946. The books I could read, but with great difficulty because she had a particularly challenging handwriting style. So through a professor at the University of Toronto, I was introduced to three ladies in the Czech Republic who then, each one got one of her books. I scanned, emailed, and they scanned back, and they transcribed, they didn't translate, they transcribed the text into Word, and they were sending me the pages with her notes, her diary in Czech. And I wanted that in writing, so I wanted to read and hear her voice as she had written it. Then what I did was take a software translation program and translate those books into English. And that worked pretty well. I got maybe 85-90% of the translations done, because I would then read the Czech, read the English, and say, did that make sense? Was that matching up? Did it work? But throughout the different pages, I would always come across some words that didn't make sense, or there wasn't a word that translated, because, of course, her writings were from about 50 or 60 years ago. Old Czech, if you want to call it that, and the translation software just didn't know those words. So I thought, okay, how can I finish off these books? So I called up Dasha, and I explained to her what I was doing, and she said, great, wonderful, let's work on this. So I would give her a word, or a word in Czech, and I would say, so what does that mean? And she said, well, give me the sentence. So I'd read her the sentence. Give me the paragraph. So I'd read her the paragraph. And he said, okay, so that particular word means such and so in that particular context. I thought these exercises, and there were a lot of these gaps that I had identified in the translation. So I thought, one of these translations would take maybe 3-4 minutes, quick. Not with Dasha. Once I had read her the Czech and the English, and she gave me the right wording, because of her being 10 years younger than my mother, it unleashed a whole series of memories for her, because she was there when my mother was growing up and writing these diaries. So suddenly, what I thought would be a 5-minute translation turned into like a 15, 20-minute story of her life, and remembering her sister and father and mother and brother and so forth in that particular context. And so these translations, I ultimately finished them, and they're a really interesting book of memories of her early years, but it was to a large extent through the help of Dasha that I managed to fill in all of these gaps of her life. Talk about how lives are sometimes intertwined. Was it Martin? You mentioned the Pelnars, right? Yeah. So Tom and Ivana are mentioned there in the diaries because their mother, Hanna, was my mother's best friend over, 50 years, 60 years? Long time. Forever, yeah. And in the diaries, my mother actually wrote down, I've met this really interesting lady called Hanna. And that was about the early 40s when their relationship started to develop. She then mentions your dad. She was at the wedding and so forth. And they mentioned, I think, also...
in the wedding movie.
Yeah, in the wedding movie, yeah. So it's recorded. And then I think she mentioned Tom's birth as well. Just an example of how some of the families are intertwined. There are other people that I met in Toronto who left Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, that are also mentioned in the book. And it's interesting. One final note about those translations. In 1944, my mother was on a ski trip to the Beskidi to learn how to ski. And she met a bunch of fellows who were ski instructors. And in there, she made a note about two of them, one in particular, who ultimately became my father. So they met on the ski trip, and then they got married after the war. So that was how Dasha helped me with this particular project. The second project that I worked on, and the copy of that is out on the table, is when Martin gave me a copy of a book called The Otta Factory, and it was written in Czech. So again, I took the text and ran it through the translation software, and then saw that I got most of the translations properly. But again, there were gaps. So guess who I called? Dasha. And she again helped me translate some of these words. And a lot of them were technical because it had to do with the the soap-making company that our family used to own and that our great-grandfather founded in 1875. So she was aware of some of the chemistry of soap making and the technical words. So again, she helped with that translation. And the end result of that is the book outside that Martin also helped in putting in photographs and translating the photographs. And so it was a joint effort, myself, Dasha, and Martin, in putting the English version of the book together. And for us, I think it's very, very helpful because it then shows the next generation where their roots are, where they came from, way back so many decades ago. So I have many, many fond memories of Dasha. I also have one of these stories about Dasha swimming without, but I won't touch that. That's a part of her personality, and we cherish that very much. But no, I will miss her very, very much, and I'll miss our chats that we had regularly on telephone and in person, and her wisdom, and I think her spontaneity, her energy, her mental awareness of things, and how she also focused on staying fit, eating well, but also staying fit. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned from her life as we move forward with ours. And I regret to say that now with her passing, I'm the eldest in our family network, so it's a lot of responsibility, but yeah, I guess so. Thank you for your attention.
We have about 10 minutes left before the quartet starts performing. Anyone else want to say a few words? Excellent, come on, Ivana. About Kelly?
Good evening. I'm the Tom between Faye and Tom, just in case you don't know. My memories aren't as old as most of yours are. I've only known Dasha, as you all know her, for about 3.5, 4 years. I met her through Faye, who was a neighbour. And as we went on, and we'd exchange meals, and we'd meet at her place, and we'd talk. And I said, "You're from Czechoslovakia?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Then you'll know Smetana." "Oh, yes," she said. She said, "How do you know Smetana?" I said, "Well, he wrote The Battered Bride," which you Czechs probably know. And I sang in The Battered Bride when I was in high school. "Oh," she said, "do you remember any of it?" I said, "Dasha, that's 74 years ago." Anyway, she had me sing a couple of bars from one of the duets. And she looked at me and she said, "I've never heard it in English before." And we got to know each other close. She was a warm, loving person. She would call me over and she'd say, "Are you and Faye going out tonight?" I said, "No." I said, "We're having supper. Do you want to come over?" "Oh, what are you having?" I said, "We're having English pea soup." "I've never had English pea soup." I said, "Come over." She fell in love with it. I couldn't make enough of it. And then she would come over, we'd go over to her place, and she'd have us a Czech meal, and we did this quite a lot of times over the past 3.5 years. And I learned a lot from her. She always had a story to tell. And it was fascinating because she was going into history, part of which I can remember living through the war and remembering the German bombing and losing my own home at one time. I was only a child at the time. And we didn't go through anything near what those who in the occupied countries did. We were bombed, but we were never invaded, and we were never lived under Nazi tyranny. And then, of course, as you all know, the Germans were defeated, and then the Russians moved in. And Dagmar said the life was even worse under the Russians. Those of us who haven't experienced that can't even imagine the type of life that she had to live. And as she told me, her brother was imprisoned for crossing the border. And we just can't imagine that sort of thing. Anyway, you know, the last time I saw Dagmar intimately at a meal was the Thursday before she died. I said, Dagmar, we're having a pork tenderloin dinner. She said, pork tenderloin? I don't think I've had that. So I love cooking, and I did a pork tenderloin, Brussels sprouts, potatoes, carrots, and she came over and we had wine and we had dinner and we talked till about 10 o'clock. And she left happy. I saw her once more in the corridor as she was going down to swim. And of course I got the email from Martin on the Thursday morning, check on Mum, I can't reach her. I was at the doctor's office at the time, I had an appointment. And when I got there and I took the key and opened the door to Dagmar's unit, and I saw the paramedics, I knew the worst had happened. And my heart dropped. And I phoned Faye. I said, Faye, you gotta come home. And I miss her terribly. Raise your glasses, ladies and gentlemen, to Dagmar, a life well lived.
I am Ivana Pelnar Zyko, or born Ivana Pelnařová, one of that family mentioned here. My mother was the best friend since youth with Aunt Micah, Martin's, Mia's, George, etc., George's mother. And there's something I found amongst her papers that I thought people would enjoy, except I don't know how many of you speak Czech. How many of you here are Czech? Quite a few. It probably is worth it. Dasha and I had two things in common: music and gardens. I have a music degree, so we always understood each other very well. And we were honored that Dasha, in her high 80s, actually came down to Georgia, where we live, to visit us for a week. And I was going to say that I took her to some fantastic gardens and to some concerts, but if you have ever been somewhere with Dasha, you know she took me. But what I discovered, and it was mentioned here several times, I discovered something from July 2001, when my mother, you have to imagine, was 10 years older than Dasha. But they paid a visit to the cottage, the aforementioned cottage. And because my mother's not here, she passed away before Dasha did. And unfortunately, she passed away right before COVID, and we never were able to have a memorial for her. So this is to remember them both. I'm sorry. So I found this. Dasha had one thing in common with my mother, and that was, if anybody had a birthday, nobody mentioned this before, but birthday or a celebration, you didn't just get a card, you got a poem. For example, I don't know if you remember your parents' anniversary. My mother not only wrote a poem, she also did a painting, and she did one of these poems where she pointed to the illustrations and sang the song.
I think she even did like a roll-up
A roll-up scroll.
That's like my mom's place.
So they had a lot of fun. But this is something I found, and my mother always wrote her poems, and you will probably find it in a guest book from the cottage. Did you find a guest book from the cottage? And this is what she must have written in there. And this is unfortunately in Czech. This is my mother writing into the Dagmar's and Vláďa's book. Dřív než sneseš kufry kosti, Rydlo řekne, kniha hostí, je tu pro vás povinností. Konec, napište to bez milosti. Někdy ale starší mozky jsou paměti jenom trosky. Zvlášť, když běží pobyt hostí v pohodě a bez starostí. Zase doma, klidně sedíš, po dovolené si medíš. Vzpomínáš, jak večer západ přes jezero zrodil nápad. Červánky i zlatem svítí, nutno flašku otevříti. Zapít poetickou chvíli, jiná kouzla se tu také sídlí. Skinny dip! Voda tě hladí, i když těla nestkví mládí. Kouzla má to zaplavání, možná soused podívání. Jako mládí na vzpomínku, buřty pečem na ohýnku, měsíc svítí, jen chybí kytary, aby se staré písně zpívaly. Ráno, když se chladí trochu, zatop v krbu, Vláďo hochu. Do hněda pak topinku pečeme na ohýnku. Nesmí zapomenout Hana, jak Dášou na křen je... Křen? Nevím, je brána. Kdy pádlem... na Keniu. Jak Dášou na Keniu je brána. Sorry. Kenu. Kdy pádlem vládla naposled? To je asi 1000 let. Vzpomínky krásné jen se vinou, jedna za druhou stýká jinou. Když náhle tu zazvoní sel, aby tu cejk tu k čertu šel. Že jsi pěkný vykuk host, zapomněl na tu povinnost. A tak Pega se osedláš a do básnění hned se dáš a nechceš pohněvat přátele, s nimiž vycházíš vesele. Vždycky máš dobrou pohodu, nespoléháš na náhodu, protože s vámi je nám krásně, tak i snadno píšem básně. Nám se tak v chatě líbilo, že vše jak v pohádce bylo. Nezbývá tudíž, než vzdát dík, ze srdce Hana a Přemík.
By the way, so this was like a legacy at the cottage. It actually got started by Mia's dad. And it was like, you couldn't just say, hi, it was a really nice time. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, like you have to compose a poem. You have to do drawings in it. Like you have to do arts and crafts. Like it was this big thing that grew and grew and grew.
Caesar recipe.
Yeah, the Caesar recipe was in there. So anyways, I got to find that. I know where the book is, so I got to pull that out. Anyone else? Faye?
A few Januaries ago, I was getting all decked up to go to a Burns supper. So you know that I'm a Scot. I got it all dressed up in my kilt and my velvet black vest and all. And I thought, I'm going to go over and see Dagmar and let her see my outfit. So I go in. And you know, our tartan is a check, right? We call it a check, but we call it a tartan. Well, the place was full of checks. And it was all Dagmar's family. And I felt quite embarrassed. But they were gracious, and they were respectful, and we had a great time together. So, my kind of check, your kind of check. Who cares?
Anyone else want to come up? Awesome. Thank you everyone for, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your kind words, for the memories, really something special. We're gonna take a quick 5-minute break, and then we're gonna go outside, and we've got a quartet there. So that's the last part of the evening. You can go and sit outside. There are chairs out there. They're gonna be underneath the roof over here, so they're in the shade. And we're gonna play 4 pieces. Yeah, you have to have music here, of course. They are they are the Odin Quartet. They're going to talk more about the pieces specifically. They're performing at the Collingwood Music Festival as well, and Daniel actually connected me up with them, and Alex and I have actually become quite good friends. They are going to perform 4 pieces that had huge sentimental value for Dagmar. The first one is Dvorak, the Slavonic Dances, number 2. Albione Adagio, Smetana, My Vlast, or My Homeland. And finally, Suk, the Serenade for Strings in E major. Downstairs, there's a bar so you can refill. There are also desserts downstairs, and these are kolachki. Yeah, kolachki are like this famous thing, like we had them at our wedding and everything. It's a very common Czech dessert. The trick is finding these kolachki because they don't make them around here that much. So I was actually finding a place down in Texas, of all places, that had it. I was about to say I'm ordering it from Texas because it's going to come here and I'll get it figured out. And I actually found a place in North Toronto. Thank you, Zita, where are you? So I ordered from there. They delivered them this morning, warm at 9:30, freshly made this morning. So downstairs, you'll see them, nice circular ones. There are cheese ones, there are jam ones, there are raspberry ones. So enjoy. We'll see you downstairs in about 5 minutes.